to stand up against the poison of white supremacy, as I did in my inaugural address, to single out as the most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy. And I'm not saying this because I'm at a black HBCU. I say it wherever I go.
I think I bring a couple of things to the table. One is the Democrats love to take the knife and put it in that mustard jar of racism and smear it over every issue they can possibly smear it over. They're always yelling and screaming about systemic racism. It is a lie, and I can refute that, I think, in a way more passionately and perhaps more persuasively than other people can. And that lie is not just a lie. Lots of people believe things are just false. This lie has real-world consequences in two ways. It's causing the police to pull back. It's called the Ferguson effect or the George Floyd effect. And there are literally thousands of people who are dead who otherwise wouldn't be dead if the police were doing their normal proactive policing. And most of those who are now dead who wouldn't be dead are the very black and brown people that people on the left claim that they care about. Going on about the other thing is, if you're a young black man, you get a steady diet of the police are out to get me, whether it's from a Barack Obama or Al Sharpton or Joe Biden, why should you cooperate when you get pulled over? Firstly, every one of these high-profile shootings and deaths would have not occurred had the suspect or civilian simply complied. Comply, you won't die. But if I'm a young man and I'm being told that the people behind me with the flashing red lights are going to harm me, why should I cooperate? So this is the damage that's being done by this lie. The other thing I bring to the table, Steve, is the fact that our side does not talk enough about the 10,000-pound elephant in the room, and that is the epidemic of fatherlessness. 40% of all American kids enter the world without a father in the home married to the mother. 70% of blacks, half of Hispanics, 25% of whites. And forget about elder. I always try and use left-wing sources whenever I make arguments. Barack Obama once said, a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime. And this is what's going on right now in our country. We've incentivized women to marry the government. We've incentivized men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And we don't talk enough about this.
So those are really big and so important, those things. Let's just dive into a little bit. On the first, in terms of the racial politics that the Democrats are pushing, it is so divisive. It is the exact opposite of what they said. You know, going on with Biden going about unity. What can you do to, I mean, obviously, stop doing what they do in terms of kind of inflaming racial tensions? What positively can you do to bring the country together?
Change the rhetoric. Biden just spoke at Howard University, and he said the #1 threat to the homeland is white supremacy. Are you smoking something? The Southern Poverty Leadership Conference put out a report about the number of people that were killed because of white extremists last year. 25. 10,000 blacks were murdered in 2020. Almost all murdered by other black people. The CDC said a young black male, ages 10 to 43, I consider that to be young because I'm 71, 10 to 43.
You're not 71.
Come on, black don't crack, you know that. The older the berry, the sweeter the juice. A young black man aged 10 to 43 is 13 times more likely to be murdered than a young white man, same demo. Now, unless you're prepared to say blacks are just genetically inclined to commit crime, you have to ask yourself what's going on. And what's going on is, as I said before, the epidemic of fatherlessness, and we don't talk enough about that. So it's just a huge lie. And it's pitting people against each other. It's causing blacks to demand things, to think that they're victims, to think that they're oppressive. That's why we're having this ridiculous conversation about reparations. It's absurd that somebody owes me something because of something that somebody else did to my ancestors. I mean, that we're even talking about this, to me, is just amazing.
And it's interesting. I mean, even here in California, which was the first. I mean, we've got something coming up on how a lot of the crazy ideas start here.
They start here and they percolate everywhere else. Yes.
But on reparations, actually, even the Democrats are sort of realizing now it's out. Now they've sort of got it going. They're pulling back because it seems, you know.
Well, the Reparations Task Force recommended $1.2 million for every black person in California, which comes to about $800 billion. The entire budget is $300 billion, so it's 2.5 times bigger than the budget. We don't have the money. And even Gavin Newsom is now saying that he doesn't support cash payments. He says it's bigger than cash payments. What's bigger than cash payments? He didn't realize they were going to empty the vault. Now he's embarrassed because he wants to be president. He knows he's on the wrong side of that issue.
Not to mention, by the way, every time we discuss this, I always point out, yes, there has been historical racial injustice. Of course, really, slavery the worst example, but, you've seen it with Native Americans. You've seen it here in California with Asian people, with Mexican people. There's a lot of racial injustice that's happened, and the best thing we can do is to make sure that we have policies that give equal opportunity today for everyone.
Absolutely. And
every race.
And the other problem with this is that California entered the Union in 1850 as a free state. It was never a slave state. So the panel deals with that inconvenient fact by saying, well, it's about things like redlining and mass incarceration and over-policing. Even if you could argue that blacks were victimized by all those things, every one of us, you have, as you pointed out, the prejudice against Chinese Americans. And Japanese Americans at one time could not own farmland in California. And Chinese Americans were, by law, barred from participating in certain industries in the Bay Area. Yet, if you look at the net income, household income of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, it is higher than the average household income of white Americans. How do you explain that? Hard work, believing in family, and embracing education.
The family stuff, I'm glad you brought that in there because it's actually such an, I make this argument all the time, our audience knows that, which is it's not just the social points, it's the economic. Actually, if you want social mobility, the best thing you can do is try and make sure that kids are raised in a stable home. I mean, the data shows that. We're all told to follow the data. That's what it says.
Stable homes and schools where you actually graduate with the ability to read, write, and compute at grade level. 75% of black boys in California cannot do reading at grade proficiency level. 85% nationwide of blacks in America are neither reading nor math proficient. And yet the Democrats oppose school choice, which studies have shown will improve graduation rates and reading rates and retention rates and all these kinds of things. So we're spending half of our budget in California on education, more than ever on K through 12, with worse results.
So last quick question before we take a break. We'll come back. There's a lot to talk about, Ukraine and China and all the rest of it. But one question I know a lot of people have, who are big fans of you, and they're big fans of President Trump, and they say, why is Larry running against President Trump?
To people who say that, I ask them a few questions. Have you lost any friends because of your support for Donald Trump? Have you tiptoed around coworkers because of your support for Donald Trump? Do you no longer have the same relationship you have with relatives because of Donald Trump? If the answer to that is yes, yes, and yes, and for most of us it is, I submit to you, Houston, we've got a problem. So if you like Trump policies, but for reasons that are probably entirely pathological, maybe someday they'll develop a vaccine for Trump derangement syndrome. But until they do, we've got a problem. If you like Trump policies, you need a messenger to deliver those for whom people in the middle, the so-called swing voters, can vote. I'm that man.
All right.
Are you going to apologize like Cory Booker
Apologize
has called
for what?
Cory Booker's called for it.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. The blinders have been taken off. They've all of a sudden seen a hell of a lot clearer. They're seeing, geez, the reason I was able to stay sequestered in my home is because some black woman was able to stack the grocery shelf.
When may I expect dinner, Beulah?
Presently, Mr. Herrick. Presently.
What would the noontime be without the classic Leave It to Beulah? Beulah, who's always in the kitchen,
But never seems to know what's cooking.
You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent. I'm not joking.
The world is different. There's too much unfinished business for us to just look backwards. We have to look to the future.
I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
That's right.
And by the way, I sit on the stand, and it get hot. I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun. And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. They'd look at it. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I've loved kids jumping on my lap.
Even call centers, which rushed overseas in the hundreds of thousands. How many times you get the call? I'd like to talk to you about your credit card. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. They're going to put you all back in chains.
In my opinion, we don't need white people leading the Democratic Party right now. The Democratic Party is diverse, and it should be reflected as so in our leadership.
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
Why does this happen?
I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this, Chuck, I'm not going to do this because let me just be really clear. Vice President Biden absolutely has a respect level for all people around him, for voters across this country, young people, older voters, voters of color, black people, Latino voters, indigenous, Asian American, Pacific Islander. So I'm not going to even traffic in any hypothetical conversation about if he is sensitive enough.
In my opinion, we don't need white people leading the Democratic Party right now.
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
I think Joe Biden might be suffering from that same white entitlement and privilege and ego, where he's just that old school white male who feels like, hey, man, they need me, I don't need them, or I got them already.
Joe Biden is under fire this evening on comments he made about working alongside segregationist senators in the past.
Biden recalling his early Senate career, bringing up two segregationist senators, Herman Talmadge and James Eastland, who called African Americans an inferior race. I was in a caucus with James O. Eastland, Biden said. He never called me boy, he always called me son. At least there was some civility. We got things done. We didn't agree on much of anything. We got things done.
I think the two-party system, although my Democratic colleagues don't like me saying this, I think the two-party system is good for the South and good for the Negro, good for the black in the South. Other than the fact that they still call me boy, I think they've changed their mind a little bit.
And by the way, what you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African-American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community.
It's that old school white male.
They're going to put you all back in chains.
30 seconds or less. What kind of a chance would a northeastern liberal like Joe Biden stand in the South if you were running in Democratic primaries against Southerners like Mark Warner and John Edwards?
Better than anybody else. And you don't know my state. My state was a slave state. My state is a border state. My state is the 8th largest black population in the country. My state is anything from a northeast liberal state.
It's that old school white male.
Choosing Joe to be my vice president was one of the best decisions I ever made.
Not the first sort of mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man.
My son is Attorney General a year in Iraq, came back, and that's one of the things that he finds was most in need. When he was over there in Iraq for a year, people would come to him and talk about what was happening to them at home in terms of foreclosures, in terms of bad loans that were these Shylocks who took advantage of these women and men. Back from Mumbai to go meet with President Xi in China, I stopped in Singapore to meet with a guy named Lee Kuan Yew, who most foreign policy experts around the world say is the wisest man in the Orient.
There's not a racist bone in my body. But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
It's not about justice. It's not about agenda. It's not about mobilizing people. It's about dialing for corporate dollars. These two parties have sold the U.S. government and the American people to the highest bidders.